Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, the rise of violence against Asian Americans. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. Recognize that we need help, we need protection, and we need people in power to stand up for us against hate. Georgia State Senator Dr. Michelle Au reacting to the murder of 8 in Atlanta, 6 of them Asian American. That was 3 weeks ago, but just this week, a man pummeled an elderly Asian woman to the ground on a New York City street. In a recent Boston University online survey, 70% of the young Asian Americans who responded said they or their family members had suffered COVID-19 discrimination. Another 15% reported physical or verbal assaults. Why is this violence continuing to happen, and what can be done to stop hate against Asian American Pacific Islanders? Joining us, Michelle Wu, Councilwoman at Large for the City of Boston. Councilwoman Wu is the first Asian American woman to serve on the council and the first woman of color to ever serve as council president. Carolyn Chu, Executive Director of Asian American Resource Workshop. Bethany Lee, a senior attorney leading the Asian Outreach Unit at Greater Boston Legal Services. And Edward Shea, editor of the Sampan newspaper. He's also the Chief Operating Officer at the Asian American Civic Association. Welcome to all of you. So I want to start with the Atlanta murders and the impact, because all of you would say to me, this is violence that's been going on for some time. But the Atlanta murders really highlighted it in a way that it seems the general public really did not respond to before. Bethany, why do you suppose that was?
It was so visible, right? And I think that already in an environment where people were talking about anti-Asian violence, suddenly you have 8 people who are murdered, most of whom are Asian women. And really, what is important about that moment, I think, is also you see the intersections of, workers, people potentially with, immigration status that is, there's intersections of a lot of things when we talk about gender, race, immigration status. And I think that's really what hit home also for all of us who work with low-income Asian immigrant communities. That is, all of these workers have been going to work this entire time during the pandemic when many of us have been able to work at home. And so that, I think, also hit home for me.
So, Michelle Wu, there is a history in the United States of violence against and discrimination against Asian American Pacific Islanders. First, briefly just share some of that history so people understand what we're talking about.
It's been a cyclical experience for so many sub-communities within the Asian American community and overall to face this sense that we are perpetual foreigners in this country, constantly asked, where are you from? Where are you from? Well, the truth is there have been Asian Americans in this country for a very long time. But from the beginning, there was strong racism and discrimination, from the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the very first legislation to specifically target and exclude a particular ethnic group, to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, to the hate crimes and violence fueled by economic strains and sense of competition against Asia in the 1970s, to post 9/11 targeting of the Sikh community. And so we've seen a cyclical experience of scapegoating, othering, and violence against Asian Americans.
But what you call unconscionable is the linking by former President Trump of Asian Americans to COVID-19. Before you respond, let's take a listen to former President Trump.
All different names. Wuhan was catching on. Coronavirus, right? Kung flu, yeah. Maybe that's a question you should ask China. Don't ask me, ask China that question, okay? When you ask them that question, you may get a very unusual answer. Yes, behind you, please.
What was the damage done by that, Michelle Wu?
Yeah, this weaponizing and unconscionable blaming of Asian Americans and linking of a certain group of people to the devastation caused by this pandemic, the strain and the economic toll and the lives lost. This has really accelerated the harm that has been done. And we felt this in Boston very early on, even before the virus was spreading in the United States, when the news was just starting to come. The way that this former administration was describing it, referring to it, connecting it to a specific group of people. We saw the toll in Chinatown, where businesses immediately experienced a huge drop in business with racism and xenophobia. And I think Asian Americans everywhere began to feel that sense of really sticking out and feeling the sense of harassment, discrimination that has only accelerated over this last year.
So, Carolyn, one of the statistics that are particularly shocking is that the increase in violence, and by the way, that was before Atlanta, is a 149% uptick against Asian Americans in the last year because of some of this kind of language. You just recently did a Facebook town hall, 3,000 people engaged with that. What were some of the top things you were hearing about the fear in the community and the anger, I would imagine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, for our communities, the fear and the anger, it goes far beyond this year, right? Our folks are working class folks, are immigrants, are people of color, and experience, all those kinds of violence, right? From wage theft to domestic violence to deportation, and now to, as we were talking about, this rise over this year. So folks are scared, as Bethany said, to go to work. All the low wage workers we know who have to go every day. And we really want to build community solutions. So ways that we can all show up for each other and make sure that folks feel safe, right? And are able to do the things they need to do to survive. And that we get at the structural roots of all the kinds of violence our people experience. When
you say structural roots, what do you mean?
I think, a lot of it is around equitable COVID recovery, right? So how do we make sure that our communities and other low-income communities of color, working class communities of color have access to housing, right? And not getting evicted through this time. Food access. I mean, a lot of us have been doing a lot of work to just get folks access to culturally relevant groceries in this time, right? Making sure folks have access to good jobs, language access across services. These are basic things that while we may feel like, they don't address this moment, they do, because these are the underlying systems that impact our people's everyday lives.
So Edward, you're the editor of a newspaper, and one of the things that should be noted here is that as I mentioned, that uptick in violence, which is amazing, the percentage uptick in violence, there has not been a major incident in Greater Boston that we know of that's been reported. Some part of that could be that, hey, everybody, this is great, it hasn't happened here, and nobody wants to have it happen here. I want to be clear about that. But how are people holding themselves together with that kind of hold your breath when you're watching it everywhere else? And by the way, that doesn't mean that there is not stuff happening on side streets that we don't know about. It's just that a major incident has not been reported here. But as a person who's editor of a newspaper, what are you hearing?
So we have heard of minor incidents, and also the Boston Police Department has reached out to us to, ask us to report to them if anything has come up. They've actually set up a task force on it. So I think there is that sentiment there of maybe there's some underreporting, because I think it might be actually cultural even. I mean, generally speaking, well, I don't want to, cast a blanket statement, but in the past, Asian cultures have tended not to turn to authority figures, to officials to report things, because there's a combination of public charge fear. There's just the way sort of we're raised. And it's, it's a concern that we have here that there's not enough being told. And also, I think as from the newspaper standpoint, what we're seeing is that this is a heightened look at what has already been happening for many, many months and years now. And I think we need to tell more stories. And for example, an example that just happened to our newspaper, we published a speech we did with Senator Markey the other day, and instantly, within 3 seconds, we had about a dozen comments that were very negative and anti-Asian on the Facebook page. And in the past, that might have just been brushed off as, oh, okay, well, it's the internet, whatever. But now this is the time where we have to talk about incidents like that to make sure that people understand it's not appropriate to blame, Asian citizens for the coronavirus. We're not the source of it. It's bigger than that. So I think there has to be more communication, not just out to other cultures and to other ethnicities, but also just among the communities in Chinatown and Greater Boston.
So I note that in May, I really want people to understand the level of fear that has increased across the communities, particularly among the elderly. But there are younger people who are looking at this as an opportunity to try new ways of raising awareness, not among just the Asian community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, but beyond that, because they've seen the ignorance that Edward was just mentioning. So a lot of people, as we've heard anecdotally, are moving to something that Black Americans know well, called the talk. In this TikTok video, Jane Park uses flashcards to teach her children about the impact of hate, reminiscent of the talk Black parents give their children. Take a look.
Stop. Asian. Hate. Hate. Is. I. Virus.
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 Why would we call hate a virus?
Because viruses infect people.
They infect people. Do you think hate can do the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about recent acts of violence against Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. And how did that make you feel?
Sad, because they killed people.
Mm-hmm.
They killed Asian people.
Bethany, respond to that. Those kids, by the way, are 5 and 7, the ones that you didn't see off camera.
Yeah, that's so interesting because my kids are 7 and 4. And so we've talked a little bit about, what's been happening. But to be honest, we've also had a chance to talk a little bit about, everything that's been going on with Black Lives Matter movement and the protests from over the summer. So they understand that there is violence that occurs against communities of color. And we've been able to connect that in a way, for kids that is both hopefully not totally scary, but also helps them to understand how it is that, that communities of color are experiencing violence. We have little BLM signs
Black Lives Matter. Yes.
Yes. In our window with these little kind of stuffed animals that they made, right? And so they understand that there is this interconnectedness. The interesting thing I think also has been having conversations with grandparents and parents, elderly people in our community, right? Because I think for the first time they're walking out into Chinatown and kind of realizing, oh, I might not, this might not be okay right now. I might be beaten up. And so that has, talking to them about what it means to be safe. And then it's funny, right? We are also talking about populations that have experienced more poverty for a very long time. And, one of the responses my grandfather gave me was, I have a cane, I can beat people up, right? So it's been an interesting conversation across generations.
Carolyn Chu, what are you hearing from people giving the talk, quote unquote, or people receiving it?
Yeah, I resonate with a lot of what Bethany said. And there's so many facets of it, right? I think about all the undocumented folks in our community that are so invisibilized and have so little access, right? So when Edward was talking about that fear, I think it's even deeper, right? When you don't have status or when you have other reasons that you actually can't do things like call the police. And so, I think as Bethany said, right, this is a moment, and it's also, we understand it as connected to a broader moment of racial reckoning that we have been in, and that certainly the past 12 months have really forced the country into. So, I think this is a huge opportunity for us to build solidarity and for Asian Americans to be part of this movement for racial justice and racial reckoning. And the only other thing I'd say is I've been feeling stop Asian hate, and hate is a virus. For me, don't get at the heart of what we're trying to do, which is to move toward a different world, to move toward a just world, to move toward a world where folks' basic needs are met and people can walk down the street with dignity. So, yes, I want the violence to cease. I want folks to feel safe, but I want people to feel safe and that they live with dignity in so many ways. And so I hope that we can take this moment to both talk about the real threats, but also dream of what a real future could look like for our communities.
Edward?
If I may, Kelly. So I just want to touch on the messaging to the younger generations. I look a lot younger than I am, and I mentor a lot of high school writers for the newspaper. What I find that's a little shocking is a lot of them are not aware of many of the things that Councilor Wu mentioned, the internment camps, sort of the back issues that we've faced in past generations, and the railroad, bond servants being tortured, and then the Exclusion Act, and they have seen hate, they've seen suffering, but they don't realize how deep it is, and that has to be part of the education so that everyone understands where the systemic roots of this hatred is coming from, and then we can address it better. And that's something that I would really push for the leadership among Boston and the capital to talk about those things and acknowledge those things so that we can talk about how do we undo what's been done in the past. And it's just interesting because some of the younger generations look at the model minority myth as a good thing. Yes, we're privileged. Yes, we're able to go to a great college, but they don't understand how they got to that point. And so I would really push for that myth to be debunked, both through education and also just looking at the systems in play that continue to promote that myth.
So the model minority myth, Michelle, can be dangerous.
Absolutely. And, I was just reflecting as we've been having the conversation about the talk, to the extent that my parents gave me a version of a talk when I was younger. It was very short, right? There was experiences, some of my most visceral childhood experiences of just being out in the world and strangers shouting slurs or mimicking, sounds of sort of maybe East Asian languages or pulling of eyes. And the talk from my parents was always, just keep your head down, work harder, right? Feeding into, in some ways, this model minority myth of we can just make it if we just outperform or work harder or stay silent and just try to get through it. I hope what this moment really awakens in communities across our city is that everybody must have a voice that is heard, and we can't just work harder and keep everyone isolated. We've seen the impacts of this kind of isolation over the last year more than anything else, and now's really the moment to empower democratic participation for everyone to be involved in our processes, to be visible, to build that infrastructure, not just within individual communities, but between communities, as so many of the panelists have been saying.
So you meant small d democratic engagement, but on the larger D democratic engagement, President Biden has issued a series of executive orders or rule changes that would directly impact the Asian American Pacific Islander community, having to do with access and language in certain areas, having to do with making sure that it is clear that there is a ban on violence in various. There's a whole list of things that he can do, and he has done. However, in the Congress itself, Senator Mazie Hirono put forth a bill which said, please support and let's have legislative action that says this is unacceptable, and she can't get anybody to back that up. Well, some people, but she can't get it passed. And she's very frustrated by that. How do you respond to that? I'll start with you, Michelle.
I think it's important for the visibility to continue lifting up this issue, and I am grateful for all of the leadership that's happening on it. I would just reinforce what's been said earlier today, that almost by the time we're talking about hate crimes and enforcement, it's too late, really. And what we need to be focusing our energy, resources, political will on is stabilizing communities, creating the societies, the economic atmosphere so that everyone can live safely and joyfully, not in fear of their working conditions or housing instability or lack of transit access or breathing in pollution. And so there are so many facets of this that date back far, far before COVID-19 ever came on the scene. So we need to see this as addressing underlying issues and making sure that we are connecting every community to the chance to thrive and live in a sustainable, beautiful city.
Carolyn, I'd like you to respond to the issue of allies and the importance thereof in this moment and beyond, because we sadly know that this is not going to be the last time we talk about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a moment, as Councillor Wu was just saying, for us to really build the kind of solidarity across communities that we know is possible and we know is needed. So, you know, I think that can be a real priority in this time. And I think part of it is, yeah, folks understanding the way and learning about the way Asian Americans have been racialized and how the white supremacist system has created these wedges between communities of color intentionally to maintain the system. And so we really need to hear each other's stories, find the places where our issues intersect, which is vast, which is almost all of them, and push for that change together that's going to impact all of our communities and do the cross-racial healing we need to do. And, you know, I think we all can do better in all of our communities of taking action as a bystander, of de-escalating situations we see, and of making sure all of our people are safe. But I think there's a lot of work to do. And I think we know that so many of these issues, so many of the policy changes cut across our communities, and there's so much opportunity to build together.
Bethany, allies.
I mean, we see this in our work every single day, right? We see that we see this in deportation work. We see this in housing work. We see this in, wage theft, employment stability work, in language access, in public education. And I think, what Councillor Wu was saying earlier in terms of this reaction to the moment, and almost I think people's need to feel like there needs to be some immediate response, right? From the legislative or other angles. And I think, honestly, the response is that it takes so much more work than that to build this safer world, to build this safer community, and to build that across racial lines. And it's not just about putting up signs that say "Stop harassment" in school, right? It's actually about learning these histories, right? Seeing these, reading children's books about the internment camp, understanding what slavery means, like from the time that people are in kindergarten forward. And then continuing to build those types of connections and relationships in our workplaces, because otherwise, I think, and I think it's hard, right? I think it's hard to visualize that, because those types of changes sometimes we don't see until 20, 30 years later, right? So it's hard to be able to say, I'm making this change right now, but I think those are some of the most important changes to be making.
Edward, some of the other things one thing I've heard over and over again in the middle of this is that how important it is that Asian American Pacific Islanders are no longer seen as invisible, not only on advocating for their own communities, but in speaking back to some of this violence. Would you address that?
Sure. I mean, there's several angles there. One of the biggest one that's my personal pet peeve is that for a long time, we've been kept silent because we're been cast as the weaker crowd, even though at the flip side, we're also the model minority, the great workers, right? So, I mean, Hollywood has had a long trend of casting Asian males as comic relief or as just martial artists, stereotyping, and then casting Asian women as objects of fetishize. So that right there kind of puts us into a certain box where, people come to us for those reasons. That they don't understand everything else that we do to contribute to American society, or they marginalize it in their minds and don't acknowledge it. So in terms of speaking out, I think we have to understand that if we don't keep talking to leaders, this issue won't stay at the forefront. With my other hat on as CEO of the ACA, we help 4,000 people a year with social services, and all of them are low income and most of them are immigrants. We're a premier job training group. And we're fortunate to work with some major companies like Eversource, National Grid, Casella, and they have diversity initiatives now. And that's only because the leadership at the top of each of those companies is willing to try to increase, Asian and other ethnic groups in their leadership, forces. So though we need to keep talking to those individuals, because the fact of the matter is that, in some unfortunate way, to be a voice that's heard, you kind of have to be privileged. You have to have the stage to be able to say things. And if you don't, and if you're not hearing it from other individuals, you're not going to talk about the real issues there.
Invisibility, Michelle, will you have 30 seconds?
I think so many of us have known this feeling our entire lives of just not being represented in mainstream media and news reports. And so this is the crux of it. Every person in our city, every family, every community must feel seen, valued, treasured, and connected to every other community. So now's a moment for us to really actualize that through policy.
Thank you all so much for joining me. That's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thank you for staying with us, and stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter.